One mother bear taught baby to speak every forest animal language in one summer. What happened next was magical. The morning mist hung low between the pine trees, so thick that Ethan Marshall could barely see 20 feet beyond his cabin porch. He sat there with his coffee growing cold in his hands, listening to something that didn't quite make sense. At first, he thought his ears were playing tricks on him. The sound came from somewhere deep in the woods, a strange mixture of noises that shouldn't exist together. It was like hearing a symphony where every instrument played a different song, yet somehow they all blended into something hauntingly beautiful. There was the chittering of squirrels mixed with the low rumble of a bear. But underneath it all, something else entirely. Something that made the hair on his arms stand up, not from fear, but from a feeling he couldn't quite name. He'd been living in this remote cabin for 3 years now, ever since his wife Jessica had passed away, and he thought he knew every sound these woods could make. But this was different. This was something new. The coffee mug slipped slightly in his grip as he leaned forward, straining to hear better. The fog seemed to muffle everything, turning the forest into a world of whispers and shadows. Then he heard it again, clearer this time. It was definitely a bear cub, he was sure of that much, but the sounds coming from it were impossible. One moment it was the perfect imitation of a robin's morning song. The next it was the rapid drumming of a woodpecker, then the soft cooing of mourning doves. Each sound was perfect, too perfect to be mere coincidence or accident. Ethan set his mug down on the wooden railing and stood up slowly, his joints protesting after sitting still for so long. He'd seen plenty of bears in his time here, watched cubs play and mothers fish in the stream that ran behind his property. But he'd never heard anything like this. Moving as quietly as he could, though he knew his human footsteps would never be as silent as he wished, Ethan made his way down the porch steps. The wooden boards creaked under his weight, each sound seeming impossibly loud in the morning stillness. He followed the sounds deeper into the woods, using the trees as cover, though he wasn't entirely sure why he felt the need to hide. Perhaps it was instinct, or perhaps it was the strange feeling that he was about to witness something that wasn't meant for human eyes. The fog began to thin as he moved away from the cabin, and shafts of early morning sunlight started breaking through the canopy above. The sounds grew louder, more distinct, and now he could hear something else too. A deeper voice, patient and rhythmic, like a teacher giving a lesson. Through a gap in the undergrowth, Ethan finally saw them. In a small clearing bordered by ancient oaks and young birch trees, a mother bear sat with her cub. But this was no ordinary scene of maternal care. The mother, a beautiful cinnamon-colored bear with eyes that seemed to hold more intelligence than any bear Ethan had ever encountered, was making deliberate sounds. Not just bear sounds, but a careful progression of forest voices. She would make a sound, then wait, watching her cub with an intensity that spoke of purpose. The cub, smaller than most spring cubs and with fur so dark it was almost black, would attempt to copy the sound. Sometimes he got it right immediately. Other times it took several tries, but the mother never showed impatience. She simply repeated the sound, adjusting something in her throat or the position of her mouth, demonstrating with a precision that seemed almost human in its intentionality. Ethan found himself holding his breath as he watched. The cub was trying to imitate the call of a blue jay now, that harsh, demanding cry that usually announced danger in the forest. The first attempt was close but not quite right, too soft, lacking the sharp edge that made jays such effective alarm systems. The mother made the sound again, and Ethan could see her actually positioning her tongue differently, showing the cub how to create that particular tone. The cub tried again, and this time it was perfect. So perfect that actual blue jays in nearby trees answered back. their voices mixing with the cub's in a confusion of real and imitated calls. The mother made a soft huffing sound that Ethan recognized as approval, and the cub bounced slightly on his paws, clearly pleased with himself. What struck Ethan most wasn't just the impossible nature of what he was witnessing, but the systematic way the mother was teaching. This wasn't random mimicry or playful imitation. She had a method, a curriculum almost. She started with simple sounds, single notes like the chirp of a cricket or the buzz of a bee, then gradually moved to more complex vocalizations. Bird songs came next, each species carefully demonstrated and practiced until the cub could reproduce them flawlessly. Then came the mammals, the chittering of squirrels, the sharp bark of a fox, even the subtle snuffling sounds that rabbits made when they were content. Each lesson built on the last, creating a foundation of understanding that went beyond mere sound reproduction. As the days passed, Ethan found himself returning to the same spot every morning, hidden behind a thick cluster of ferns that provided perfect cover. He brought a notebook, though he wasn't sure why at first. Maybe it was the scientist in him, the part that had once worked as a wildlife biologist before grief had driven him to solitude. Or maybe it was simply the human need to document the miraculous, to prove to himself that what he was seeing was real. He wrote down everything he observed, filling page after page with detailed notes about the lessons, the progression of sounds, the way the mother bear seemed to understand not just the mechanics of each call, but its meaning and purpose in the forest's complex communication network. The mother bear, who Ethan had started thinking of as Savannah in his mind, though he couldn't say why that name felt right, showed a patience that was almost supernatural. When the cub, who had become Logan in Ethan's private narrative, struggled with a particular sound, she would break it down into smaller components. The trill of a red-winged blackbird, for instance, was taught in 3 parts. First, the initial note, clear and strong. Then, the warbling middle section that gave the call its distinctive character. Finally, the trailing notes that signaled all clear or continuing alarm depending on their pitch. Logan would practice each part separately, over and over, until he could blend them together seamlessly. But it wasn't just the sounds themselves that Savannah was teaching. Ethan began to notice that she was also conveying context, meaning the subtle variations that changed a simple call into a complex message. A robin's song at dawn meant something different from the same song at midday. The alarm call of a chickadee had gradations of urgency that corresponded to different types of threats. A squirrel's chatter could express annoyance, warning, or even a kind of gossipy communication about food sources. Savannah demonstrated these nuances with remarkable precision, and Logan absorbed them all with an eagerness that spoke of deep intelligence. One morning, about 2 weeks into his observations, Ethan witnessed something that made him question everything he thought he knew about animal intelligence. Savannah was teaching Logan the complex vocal patterns of wolves, even though there were no wolves in these woods, hadn't been for decades. She produced perfect howls, yips, and whines, each with distinct meanings that Ethan recognized from his years of studying wolf behavior. But then, she did something extraordinary. She began combining the wolf calls with bear vocalizations, creating a hybrid language that shouldn't exist. Logan listened intently, his small head tilted to one side, then attempted the combination. It took him several tries, but when he finally succeeded, the sound that emerged was unlike anything Ethan had ever heard. It was communication elevated to art, a voice that could speak across a species' boundaries. The forest itself seemed to respond to these lessons. Ethan noticed that other animals began gathering at the edges of the clearing during the daily sessions. At first, it was just a few curious squirrels and birds, but soon there were deer standing in the shadows, rabbits emerging from their burrows, even a fox that sat perfectly still on a fallen log, all watching the unprecedented education taking place. They didn't flee from the bears as they normally would. Instead, they seemed to understand that something important was happening, something that might involve them all. The clearing had become a classroom, and the forest creatures were all students, learning by observation even if they couldn't participate directly. Logan's progress was remarkable. By the end of the first month, he could reproduce virtually any forest sound with perfect accuracy. But more than that, he was beginning to use these voices in context. When a hawk circled overhead one afternoon, Logan produced a series of alarm calls in different animal languages, warning the various creatures in their own tongues. The response was immediate and coordinated. Small animals taking cover while birds fell silent, everyone understanding the message regardless of which version they heard. It was like watching someone conduct an orchestra, each section responding to cues that created a harmonious whole. Ethan's notebook grew thick with observations, but he found himself writing less about the technical aspects of what he was seeing, and more about the emotional impact. There was something profoundly moving about watching Savannah's dedication to her son's education. This wasn't instinct or simple training. This was a mother passing on a gift, a sacred knowledge that she somehow possessed and was determined to share. The love between them was palpable, visible in every patient repetition, every gentle correction, every moment of celebration when Logan mastered a particularly difficult sound. It made Ethan's chest ache with memories of his own loss, but also filled him with a strange hope he hadn't felt in years. The lessons weren't confined to vocalizations either. Savannah taught Logan to read the subtle body language that accompanied different calls. A squirrel's tail position could change the entire meaning of its chatter. The way a bird ruffled its feathers while singing could indicate anything from contentment to agitation. Logan learned to observe these details, to understand that true communication involved more than just sound. He began incorporating these physical elements into his own communications, using bare body language while producing bird calls, creating a multi-layered form of expression that was entirely unique. One particularly memorable morning, Ethan watched as Logan had what could only be described as a conversation with a family of raccoons. The raccoons had wandered into the clearing, probably searching for food, and seemed startled to find the bears there. But instead of the usual standoff that might occur between different species competing for territory, Logan began making the soft trilling sounds that raccoons use with their young. The adult raccoons stopped, their masked faces showing what Ethan could only interpret as confusion. Logan continued, adding in some chittering sounds, and even the purring noise that raccoons made when content. Slowly, cautiously, the raccoons approached. What followed was a 15-minute exchange that involved sounds from both species, gestures, and what appeared to be genuine communication about something specific, though Ethan couldn't determine what. The implications of what he was witnessing kept Ethan awake at night. If bears could learn to speak the languages of other animals, if true interspecies communication was possible, what did that mean for our understanding of animal intelligence? What did it mean for the entire ecosystem? He thought about writing to his old colleagues, sharing his discovery with the scientific community, but something held him back. This felt too precious, too pure to expose to the world of research grants and academic papers. Besides, who would believe him without proof? And getting proof would mean disrupting this miraculous education, possibly frightening Savannah and Logan away forever. As spring turned toward summer, the lessons became more sophisticated. Savannah began teaching Logan about the seasonal variations in animal communications. The songs birds sang during mating season were different from their territorial calls. The sounds animals made when food was abundant varied from the calls of scarcity. There were special vocalizations for warning about specific predators, for announcing the discovery of water during dry spells, for gathering families before storms. Logan absorbed it all, his young mind apparently capable of storing and categorizing hundreds, maybe thousands of distinct vocalizations and their meanings. But perhaps the most remarkable development came when Logan began creating his own combinations, mixing languages in ways that Savannah hadn't taught him. He would start with the melodious song of a thrush, blend it into the rhythmic drumming of a woodpecker, and end with the soft cooing of doves, creating messages that no single species could produce, but that all seemed to understand. It was like watching the birth of a new language, a forest Esperanto that could unite all the woodland creatures in understanding. Savannah watched these innovations with what Ethan could only describe as pride, occasionally adding her own voice to support or enhance Logan's creations. The forest was changing around them. Ethan noticed it in small ways at first. There were fewer territorial disputes between different species. Predators still hunted, of course. That was the way of nature. But there seemed to be more warning, more opportunity for prey to escape. Food sources were shared more readily, with one species alerting others to discoveries of fruit trees or nut caches. It was as if Logan's ability to communicate across species lines was creating a more cooperative ecosystem, one where information flowed freely and benefited all. The clearing where Savannah conducted her lessons had become a sort of neutral ground, a place where traditional enemies could coexist peacefully, united by their fascination with the young bear who spoke all their languages. Ethan found himself spending entire days in his hiding spot, forgetting to eat, forgetting the outside world entirely. His coffee grew cold in his thermos as he watched, transfixed. He'd started bringing his camera but couldn't bring himself to use it. Something about the mechanical click of the shutter felt like it would shatter the magic of what was happening. Instead, he relied on his notebook and his memory, sketching rough drawings of positions and postures, trying to capture in words what seemed beyond language itself. He wrote about the way morning light filtered through the leaves during the dawn lessons, how the air itself seemed to shimmer with possibility when Logan successfully mastered a particularly complex call. The bond between Savannah and Logan deepened with each passing day. There were moments of pure joy, like when Logan perfectly reproduced the complex territorial song of a cardinal and actual cardinals responded from all directions, creating a crimson flash of wings around the clearing. There were moments of frustration, too, when Logan struggled with the subtle tonal variations in owl hoots, trying again and again while Savannah patiently demonstrated the proper technique. But there were also moments of quiet understanding, when mother and son would simply sit together, communicating in their own bare language mixed with elements of all the others, creating a private dialect that was theirs alone. Other young animals began joining the lessons. A fox kit would sit at the edge of the clearing, attempting to copy Logan's vocalizations. Young rabbits would practice their thumping in rhythm with Logan's attempts at their language. Even a young deer, still spotted with youth, would stand nearby and practice the snorting and stamping that Logan demonstrated. It was becoming a forest school, with Logan as both student and teaching assistant, helping others understand the languages he was learning. Savannah allowed this, even encouraged it, seeming to understand that her son's gift was meant to be shared. The complexity of the forest's communication network became more apparent as Ethan continued his observations. He realized that what he'd always thought of as random animal noises was actually a constant flow of information. Birds announced the movement of predators, squirrels reported on food availability, Insects signaled weather changes. And now, with Logan able to understand and participate in all of these conversations, the information flowed more efficiently than ever. It was like watching the forest develop its own internet, with Logan as a living router, translating and transmitting messages across species boundaries that had existed since the beginning of time. One afternoon, Ethan witnessed something that would stay with him forever. A young rabbit had become separated from its family and was clearly distressed, making the high-pitched calls that usually brought predators rather than help. Logan heard the cries and immediately began translating, calling out in different languages to spread the word about the lost youngster. Within minutes, a network of animals had formed a sort of search party. Birds flew overhead, scanning for the rabbit family. Squirrels chattered directions from the trees. Even a passing fox, who would normally see the rabbit as prey, joined the search. When the rabbit family was finally located, Logan guided the youngster back to them, using a combination of rabbit calls for comfort and bird songs for direction. The reunion was touching, but what struck Ethan most was the cooperation, the way traditional enemies had worked together because they could finally understand each other. As his notebook filled with observations, Ethan began to see patterns in Savannah's teaching method. She wasn't just randomly selecting languages to teach. There was a structure, a progression that made sense when he mapped it out. She started with prey animals, the ones whose languages were primarily about warning and safety. Then she moved to predators, whose vocalizations often involved hunting coordination and territorial claims. Finally, she taught the languages of what Ethan thought of as the neutral parties, the scavengers and omnivores who lived between worlds. It was a complete education in forest communication, designed to give Logan the ability to understand and interact with every creature he might encounter. But there were also lessons in silence. Savannah taught Logan when not to speak, when to listen, when to let the forest's natural quiet speak for itself. These might have been the most important lessons of all. Logan learned to read the quality of silence, to understand what it meant when the birds suddenly stopped singing, when the insects ceased their buzzing, when even the leaves seemed to pause in their rustling. He learned that silence could communicate danger more effectively than any alarm call, that the absence of sound was itself a language that every forest creature understood instinctively. The summer grew warmer, and the lessons adapted to the changing season. Savannah taught Logan the lazy afternoon calls of animals resting in the heat, the evening songs that marked the transition from day-to-night creatures, the dawn chorus that welcomed each new day. She taught him the special vocalizations that accompanied thunderstorms, the ways animals communicated during droughts, the celebration sounds that followed the first rain after a dry spell. Each lesson was precisely timed to coincide with the actual conditions, so Logan could experience the context along with the sound. Ethan began to notice that his own understanding of the forest had changed. Even though he couldn't reproduce the sounds like Logan could, he was beginning to understand them. The morning bird songs that had once been pleasant background noise now carried specific information. He could tell when the jays were announcing his presence versus when they were warning about a hawk. He could distinguish between a squirrel's annoyance at another squirrel and its alarm about a climbing predator. The forest had become readable to him in a way it had never been before, even during his years as a professional wildlife biologist. He was learning the language of the woods not through direct instruction, but through observation of Logan's education. One evening, as the sun set through the trees and painted everything gold, Ethan watched Savannah and Logan engage in what could only be described as a philosophical discussion. Using their expanded vocabulary of mixed languages, they seemed to be talking about something abstract. Logan would make a series of sounds that combined elements from multiple species, and Savannah would respond with her own complex combinations. They went back and forth like this for nearly an hour, their conversation punctuated by periods of thoughtful silence. Ethan couldn't understand the content, but he could feel the importance of it. This wasn't just communication anymore. This was the exchange of ideas, the sharing of concepts that went beyond simple information transfer. The notebook that had started as a scientific record had become something more like a journal, filled with Ethan's wonder and speculation alongside his observations. He wrote about the possibility that Savannah's ability wasn't unique, that perhaps there had always been animals capable of this level of communication, but humans had simply never noticed. He wondered if Logan would pass this gift on to his own cubs someday, if the forest would gradually become a place where all animals could speak to each other. He even wondered if humans could learn these languages too, if someone patient enough could sit with Logan and learn the way he was learning from his mother. As the first month of summer passed, Logan's abilities had grown beyond simple mimicry to true fluency. He could engage in complex conversations with multiple species simultaneously, translating between them in real time. Watching him mediate a dispute between a family of squirrels and a pair of blue jays over nesting territory was like watching a skilled diplomat at work. He understood not just the words, but the emotions behind them, the cultural differences between species that went beyond language. His translations weren't literal, but interpretive, conveying meaning and intent rather than just sounds. The forest had accepted Logan as something special, something unprecedented but necessary. Where once animals would have fled from a bear cub, now they approached him with their problems and questions. A mother bird whose chick had fallen from the nest called to Logan for help. A confused butterfly that had emerged too early in the season sought his guidance. An elderly badger who could no longer hunt effectively came to him for assistance in finding easier food sources. Logan helped them all, using his gift not for any advantage but simply because he could. It was pure altruism expressed through language, and it was beautiful to witness. Savannah watched her son's development with a mixture of pride and something else, something Ethan couldn't quite identify. Sometimes she would look at Logan with an expression that seemed almost sad, as if she knew something about his future that weighed on her. During these moments, she would call him close and groom him with extra tenderness, or teach him particularly important lessons with more urgency than usual. It was as if she was preparing him for something, though Ethan couldn't imagine what that might be. The lessons had expanded beyond just animal languages, too. Savannah was teaching Logan to understand the subtler communications of the forest itself. The way the wind through different trees created distinct sounds that could indicate weather changes, the meaning behind the creaking of old wood, the rustle of underbrush, the bubble of the stream. These weren't languages in the traditional sense, but they were forms of communication that the forest used to speak to those who knew how to listen. Logan was learning to be not just a translator, but an interpreter of the forest's own voice. One morning, Ethan arrived at his usual observation spot to find the clearing empty. His heart sank, thinking that perhaps Savannah and Logan had moved on, that the magical education he'd been witnessing had come to an end. But then he heard them, their voices coming from different directions. They were practicing long-distance communication, testing how far Logan's voice could carry, how he could modify different animal calls to travel greater distances. Savannah would call from one part of the forest, and Logan would respond from another, their messages bouncing off trees and carrying on the wind in ways that seemed to defy the normal limits of sound. As he followed the sounds, Ethan discovered that the lessons were taking place across a much wider area now. Logan was learning the geography of communication, how sounds traveled differently in dense undergrowth versus open meadows, how water affected the transmission of different frequencies, how elevation changed the way calls propagated. It was advanced stuff, the kind of understanding that took most animals a lifetime to develop. But Logan was absorbing it all with the eager curiosity of youth, combined with an intelligence that seemed almost supernatural. The forest had become Logan's extended classroom, and he was its most dedicated student. He learned from everyone and everything. An old owl taught him about the acoustic properties of night hunting. A beaver showed him how sound traveled differently above and below water. Even the insects contributed their knowledge, teaching him about the vibrations that carried through soil and wood, communications that existed below the range of normal hearing. Logan's education was becoming truly comprehensive, encompassing not just languages but the entire science of forest communication. But it wasn't all serious education. There were moments of pure play, too, times when Logan would use his abilities just for fun. He would hide in the bushes and perfectly imitate the call of a rare bird, causing excitement among the actual birds. He would have mock arguments with himself in different animal voices, creating elaborate dramas that entertained the young animals who had become his regular audience. Once, Ethan watched him perform what could only be described as a comedy routine, using timing and different voices to tell jokes that had a group of young raccoons chittering with what sounded remarkably like laughter. These playful moments revealed something important about Logan's character. Despite his remarkable abilities, he was still a young bear, full of curiosity and mischief. He used his gift not as a burden or responsibility, but as a source of joy and connection. When he made a particularly good joke or successfully pulled off a complex vocal performance, his whole body would wiggle with happiness, and Savannah would make that soft, huffing sound that Ethan had learned meant approval and amusement. The relationship between mother and son was touching in its normalcy, despite the extraordinary circumstances. As Ethan watched and wrote, he began to understand that what he was witnessing wasn't just about language or communication. It was about connection, about breaking down the barriers that separated different forms of life. Logan wasn't just learning to speak different languages. He was learning to understand different perspectives, to empathize with different ways of being in the world. When he translated between species, he wasn't just converting sounds. He was building bridges of understanding that had never existed before. The impact on the local ecosystem continued to grow. Ethan documented instances of unprecedented cooperation between species. A group of squirrels and birds worked together to harvest nuts, with the birds spotting from above and the squirrels gathering below, all coordinated through Logan's translations. Predator and prey still maintained their natural relationships, but there was more warning, more fairness to the chase. Information about human threats, like approaching hikers or vehicles, spread quickly through the forest network, keeping all animals safer. The woods were becoming something new, a community rather than just a collection of competing species. Sometimes Ethan wondered if he was dreaming, if perhaps he'd invented this entire scenario out of loneliness and grief. But then Logan would do something so remarkable, so impossible to have imagined, that he knew it was real. Like the time an injured hawk fell into the clearing, and Logan not only called for help in multiple languages, but also stayed with the bird, using soft dove coos to keep it calm, while Savannah went to find specific medicinal plants that she somehow knew would help. The hawk recovered over several days, during which Logan kept it company, telling it stories in bird languages about what was happening in the forest beyond the clearing. The notebook had grown into multiple notebooks now, a comprehensive record of something unprecedented in the natural world. Ethan had started organizing his observations into categories: vocal techniques, language families, translation methods, social impacts, but no amount of scientific categorization could capture the wonder of it all. Every day brought new surprises, new demonstrations of Logan's growing abilities and the forest's adaptation to this new reality. He was documenting not just the education of a remarkable bear cub, but the evolution of an entire ecosystem. One particularly hot afternoon, when even the insects seemed too tired to buzz, Ethan watched Logan do something that made him reconsider everything he thought he knew about animal consciousness. The young bear sat in the middle of the clearing and began what could only be described as singing. It wasn't imitation of birdsong or any other animal call. It was something entirely original, a melody that combined elements from dozens of different species but transformed them into something new. It was hauntingly beautiful, expressing something that went beyond language into pure emotion. Other animals gathered to listen, sitting in perfect silence as Logan's song filled the forest. Even Savannah seemed surprised, watching her son with an expression of awe. When the song ended, the forest remained silent for several long moments, as if everyone needed time to process what they had just experienced. Then, slowly, other voices began to join in, not copying Logan's song exactly, but adding their own harmonies, their own expressions of whatever emotion the music had awakened. For perhaps 10 minutes, the forest sang together, a chorus of different species creating something that had never existed before and might never exist again. Ethan found tears streaming down his face as he listened, overwhelmed by the beauty and impossibility of it all. As the afternoon wore on and the impromptu concert ended, normal forest life resumed, but something had shifted. The animals looked at Logan differently now, not just as a translator or mediator, but as something more. He had shown them a possibility they hadn't known existed, the ability to create something beautiful together despite their differences. The young bear seemed to understand the significance of what had happened. He moved through the clearing with a new sense of purpose, as if he had discovered his true calling. Savannah's lessons continued, but they had taken on a different quality. She was no longer just teaching Logan languages, but helping him understand his role in the forest. Through complex combinations of vocalizations and gestures, she seemed to be explaining concepts like responsibility, wisdom, and the importance of using his gift for the benefit of all. Logan listened intently, occasionally asking questions in their mixed language that Ethan couldn't understand, but that seemed profound based on Savannah's thoughtful responses. The summer was reaching its peak and the forest was alive with activity. Young animals were growing, learning their own species' languages while also picking up bits of others from Logan's demonstrations. It was creating a generation that would grow up with a broader understanding of communication than any before them. Ethan could imagine a future where the forest's children would be naturally multilingual, where the barriers between species would be more permeable. Logan wasn't just learning languages. He was teaching them, spreading the gift his mother had given him to anyone willing to learn. But there was an undercurrent of urgency to Savannah's teaching now. She spent longer hours with Logan, sometimes keeping him up well past the time when bears would normally be sleeping. She taught him emergency calls, distress signals, the vocalizations that meant danger or death. She showed him how to use his voice to lead others to safety, how to coordinate large groups in times of crisis. These lessons were different from the earlier ones, less about communication and more about survival, about protecting the forest and its inhabitants from threats that Ethan couldn't identify. Logan absorbed these serious lessons with the same dedication he brought to everything else, but Ethan could see that they weighed on him. The playful cub was growing up fast, taking on responsibilities that no young bear should have to carry. Yet he never complained, never showed reluctance to learn. If anything, he seemed to understand that his gift came with obligations, that being able to speak for the forest meant sometimes having to protect it. One evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of pink and orange, Ethan witnessed a conversation between Savannah and Logan that seemed particularly significant. They sat facing each other, and Savannah began making sounds that Ethan had never heard before. They weren't animal calls or forest noises, but something older, more primitive. It was as if she was teaching Logan the original language, the one that existed before species differentiated, when all life shared a common voice. Logan struggled with these sounds at first, his young voice not quite able to capture their ancient resonance. But gradually, with patient practice, he began to approximate them. As Logan practiced these primordial sounds, the forest grew absolutely still. Every creature seemed to sense that something important was happening. The very air felt charged with significance. When Logan finally managed to reproduce one of the sounds perfectly, Ethan felt it more than heard it, a vibration that seemed to resonate in his bones. It was communication at its most fundamental level, stripped of species-specific characteristics and reduced to pure meaning. It was the language of life itself, and Logan was learning to speak it. The lesson continued until well after dark, with Savannah teaching and Logan learning by the light of fireflies and a crescent moon. Other animals had gathered at the edges of the clearing, drawn by the ancient sounds that awakened something deep in their genetic memory. Predator and prey sat side by side, united in their recognition of something far older and more important than their individual differences. It was like watching the forest remember its own origin, guided by a young bear who was becoming something unprecedented in the natural world. When the lesson finally ended, Savannah did something she had never done before. She stood on her hind legs, towering over Logan, and made a series of sounds that seemed ceremonial, almost ritualistic. Logan watched with wide eyes, then slowly stood up himself, small and uncertain on his back legs. Savannah placed her paws on his shoulders and looked directly into his eyes, communicating something that went beyond any language. It looked like a blessing, or perhaps a passing of responsibility. Logan nodded, a gesture that seemed too human, but was somehow perfect for the moment. As Ethan made his way back to his cabin that night, his mind raced with the implications of what he had witnessed. Logan wasn't just learning languages anymore. He was being initiated into something ancient and sacred, becoming a bridge not just between species but between the forest's past and its future. The education that had started as language lessons had evolved into something far more profound. Logan was being prepared for a role that hadn't existed before because there had never been anyone capable of filling it. The next morning brought a violent thunderstorm that kept Ethan inside his cabin. He sat at his window, watching the rain lash against the glass, wondering if Savannah and Logan were somewhere safe and dry. The storm lasted most of the day, and when it finally cleared in the late afternoon, the forest looked different. Cleaner somehow, refreshed, but also changed in ways Ethan couldn't quite articulate. When he made his way to the clearing, he found it empty, except for the lingering sense that something significant had transpired there. He was about to leave when he heard Logan's voice coming from the direction of the stream. Following the sound, Ethan found the young bear standing in the shallow water, surrounded by dozens of animals who had apparently been displaced or distressed by the storm. Logan was speaking to them all simultaneously, using different languages to comfort, direct, and organize. He guided a family of mice to higher ground, warned a group of rabbits about weakened burrows, helped young birds find their parents after being scattered by the wind. He was no longer just a student. He had become the forest's voice, its coordinator in times of crisis. Savannah watched from the bank, that mixture of pride and sadness even more pronounced on her face. She had succeeded in her impossible task, teaching her son not just to speak but to serve, not just to communicate but to lead. But success meant that Logan was growing beyond her, becoming something that even she might not fully understand. The gift she had given him was transforming him into a creature unique in all the world, a bear who belonged to the entire forest rather than just to his own kind. As the sun began to set on another day, Ethan realized that he had been witnessing something far greater than just an unusual education. He had been watching the birth of a new kind of being, a creature who could unite the forest in ways that had never been possible before. Logan's ability to speak all languages was just the beginning. He was becoming a living symbol of what was possible when communication replaced isolation, when understanding bridged differences. The evening air filled with the normal sounds of the forest settling for the night. But now, those sounds had meaning for Ethan. He could hear the conversations, the check-ins between families, the evening news being passed from tree to tree. And at the center of it all was Logan's voice, young but growing stronger, translating and facilitating, ensuring that every creature's voice was heard. The forest had found its speaker, and the world would never be the same. As Ethan walked back to his cabin, his notebooks clutched against his chest, he thought about Jessica and how she would have reacted to all of this. She had always believed in magic, in the possibility of miracles hiding in plain sight. She would have loved Logan, would have spent hours watching him learn and grow. In a way, witnessing this incredible education had helped heal something in Ethan that he hadn't even realized was still broken. The grief was still there, would always be there, but alongside it now was wonder, was hope, was the knowledge that the world still held mysteries worth discovering. The forest grew quiet as night fell completely, but it was a comfortable quiet, a peaceful silence that spoke of safety and community. Somewhere in that darkness, a young bear who could speak every language was probably curled up against his mother, dreaming in voices not his own. And all around them the forest listened and waited, knowing that tomorrow would bring new lessons, new connections, new possibilities for a world where every voice could be heard and understood. The story of Logan's education was far from over. In fact, it felt like it was just beginning, but already the impact was undeniable. The forest had become a different place, one where cooperation was replacing competition, where understanding was bridging ancient divides. And at the heart of it all was a small black bear cub who had learned to speak for those who had never been heard, to translate not just words, but hopes and fears and dreams. Ethan sat at his desk that night, writing by candlelight as he had grown accustomed to doing. He tried to capture in words what seemed beyond language itself, the miracle of true communication, the possibility of perfect understanding. His notebooks were filling with observations that read more like poetry than science, but perhaps that was appropriate. What Logan and Savannah were doing transcended scientific explanation. It was closer to art, to magic, to the ancient mysteries that humans had forgotten in their rush to categorize and control the natural world. Outside his window, an owl called, and immediately Ethan heard Logan's voice answering from somewhere in the distance. They exchanged several calls, probably discussing the night's hunting conditions or perhaps just checking in, making sure everyone was where they should be. It was so normal now, this impossible thing, that Ethan almost took it for granted. But then he remembered that first morning, the confusion and wonder of hearing a bear cub speak in birdsong, and he smiled. The education would continue tomorrow. Savannah would teach, Logan would learn, and the forest would adapt to its new reality. But tonight, there was peace. Tonight, every creature in the woods could rest, knowing that if they called out, someone would understand. Someone would answer. Someone would care. And that, Ethan thought as he blew out his candle, might be the most important language of all, the one that needed no translation because every living thing already knew it by heart. The forest settled into sleep, its many voices gradually falling silent. But the connections remained. Invisible threads of understanding that linked every creature to every other. And at the center of that web was a young bear whose education had only just begun, whose gift would reshape the world in ways no one could yet imagine. The summer was far from over, and there were still so many languages to learn, so many bridges to build, so many stories to tell in voices that had never been heard together before. Tomorrow would bring new lessons, new challenges, new moments of wonder. But tonight, the forest rested in the knowledge that it had found its voice, and that voice belonged to a small bear named Logan who spoke for them all. The impossible had become possible. The miraculous had become routine. And the world had become a little more connected, a little more understood, a little more whole. The ancient tree stood at the heart of the forest like a guardian of time itself, its trunk so massive that 12 bears linking paws couldn't wrap around it completely. Ethan had passed by it many times during his years in these woods, always feeling a sense of reverence for its age and majesty. But now, as he followed the increasingly urgent sounds of the forest gathering, he noticed something he had never seen before. The tree was dying. Not in the violent way of disease or storm damage, but in a slow, deep decline that seemed to emanate from its very core. The leaves, which should have been deep green in the fullness of summer, were tinged with yellow at the edges. The bark, once rough and strong, had begun to develop soft spots where it pulled away from the wood beneath. Most telling of all was the silence around it, where once birds had nested in its branches and squirrels had made highways of its limbs. Now there was an emptiness, as if the animals knew something that humans were only beginning to understand. Logan stood before the great tree with an expression far too serious for a cub his age. He placed his small paw against the trunk and made a sound that Ethan had never heard before, a low thrumming that seemed to come from deep within his chest. It wasn't any animal language, but something more fundamental, perhaps one of those ancient sounds Savannah had been teaching him. The tree seemed to respond, a faint vibration running through its wood that Ethan felt through the soles of his boots. Logan turned to his mother, and they exchanged a complex series of vocalizations that combined elements from dozens of different species. Even without understanding the specific words, Ethan could feel the weight of their conversation, the gravity of whatever they were discussing. Savannah moved closer to the tree, examining it with the careful attention of a doctor checking a patient. She sniffed at the soft spots in the bark, touched the yellowing leaves with surprising gentleness, even pressed her ear against the trunk as if listening for a heartbeat. Then she began to speak, not to Logan, but to the tree itself, using those ancient sounds that predated modern animal languages. It was a conversation that shouldn't have been possible, a bear talking to a tree, but Ethan had learned to stop thinking in terms of possible and impossible. In this forest where a bear cub could speak every language, perhaps trees could listen and respond in their own way. The next few days brought a change in the forest's atmosphere that was palpable even to Ethan's human senses. Animals began arriving from parts of the woods he'd never seen them venture from before. They came in groups that defied natural order, predators walking alongside prey, solitary creatures joining social ones. They all gathered around the ancient tree, forming concentric circles like ripples in a pond. Logan moved among them, translating concerns and suggestions, coordinating what appeared to be a massive, collaborative effort to understand what was happening to their guardian tree. The conversations were constant, a babel of voices that Logan somehow managed to orchestrate into meaningful dialogue. Through careful observation and the bits of understanding he'd gained from months of watching Logan's education, Ethan began to piece together the situation. The tree wasn't just old or sick in the normal sense. It was something more fundamental, more connected to the forest's overall health. This tree, the animals seemed to understand, was what some indigenous cultures might call a mother tree, a hub that connected the forest through underground root networks and fungal connections that scientists were only beginning to understand. Its decline meant more than the loss of a single tree. It threatened the communication network that kept the forest healthy and balanced. The mycorrhizal networks that connected tree to tree, that allowed them to share nutrients and information, all centered on this ancient giant. If it died, the forest would lose more than just a landmark. It would lose part of its ability to function as a unified organism. Savannah's urgency in teaching Logan suddenly made perfect sense to Ethan. She had known this was coming, had perhaps sensed the tree's decline before any other creature. The education she'd been giving her son wasn't just about language for its own sake. It was preparation for this moment, when the forest would need someone who could unite all its voices in a common cause. Logan wasn't just learning to be a translator. He was being trained to be a leader, a coordinator for an effort that no single species could accomplish alone. The responsibility that had seemed so heavy on his young shoulders was now revealed in its full weight. The gathering grew larger each day. Ethan counted species he'd rarely seen in these parts, some that must have traveled for miles after somehow receiving word of the crisis. There were beavers from the river valley, their engineering expertise apparently needed for something. Woodpeckers arrived in unusual numbers, their ability to understand wood rot and tree health valuable for diagnosis. Even the insects seemed organized, with ants forming precise lines that mapped the tree's root system underground, somehow communicating their findings to Logan, who translated for the larger animals. It was like watching a medical consultation where every doctor spoke a different language, but somehow, through Logan's gift, they could collaborate. Logan's role in all of this was exhausting to watch. He moved constantly from group to group, listening to theories and observations in one language, translating them into dozens of others, facilitating discussions between creatures that had never directly communicated before. A family of raccoons had noticed changes in the tree's nighttime moisture patterns. The owls reported differences in how sound echoed off its trunk. The underground creatures, moles and voles and ground squirrels, brought news of root changes that surface dwellers couldn't see. Each piece of information was crucial, and Logan made sure nothing was lost in translation. He was growing thinner from the constant work, his young voice becoming hoarse from the endless vocalizing, but he never stopped, never complained. Savannah watched her son with that mixture of pride and sorrow that had become her constant expression. She supported him when she could, taking over translation duties for simpler conversations, making sure he ate and rested when possible. But increasingly, Logan was handling things she couldn't, making connections between languages and concepts that even she hadn't fully grasped. The student was surpassing the teacher, not through any failing on her part, but because Logan's young mind could adapt and synthesize in ways that amazed everyone watching. He wasn't just using the languages he'd learned. He was creating new combinations, new ways of expressing complex ideas that no single language could convey. One morning, Ethan arrived to find Logan standing on a raised root of the ancient tree, addressing the assembled crowd like a conductor before an orchestra. He began with a series of sounds that called for attention, silence rippling outward from the tree as every creature focused on him. Then he started to explain what they'd learned, using a masterful combination of languages to ensure everyone understood. The tree, he communicated wasn't dying from disease or age alone. It was suffering from a disruption in the underground network that connected it to the rest of the forest. Something had changed in the soil chemistry, possibly from human activity upstream that Ethan felt a pang of guilt about, even though he knew it wasn't directly his fault. The solution Logan proposed was unlike anything Ethan had ever heard of. It would require cooperation on a scale that seemed impossible, even for this newly connected forest. The beavers would need to redirect water flow to flush certain toxins from the soil. The birds would need to bring specific seeds from distant parts of the forest to replant around the tree. The digging animals would create new channels for root growth. The insects would transport beneficial fungi to reestablish the mycorrhizal networks. Every species had a role, and Logan explained each one in the language that species understood best, adding encouragement and answering questions with patience that belied his youth. But the most remarkable part of Logan's plan involved something that went beyond physical intervention. He proposed that the forest needed to sing to the tree, to communicate with it in the ancient language that Savannah had taught him. Not just Logan singing, but every creature adding their voice to create a harmony that would somehow, in a way that defied scientific explanation, give the tree the strength to heal itself. It sounded impossible, mystical even, but the assembled animals accepted it without question. They had seen Logan's gift, had experienced the power of true communication. If he said singing could help save their tree, they would sing. The work began immediately. Ethan watched in amazement as the forest transformed into a coordinated work site. Beavers gnawed through specific roots to redirect water. Their usual dam-building instincts adapted to this new purpose. Squirrels and birds formed supply chains, bringing materials from far and wide. The underground creatures worked in shifts, their progress reported to Logan, who adjusted the plan as needed. It was like watching a city mobilize for disaster relief, except the citizens were animals, and their city was the forest itself. The level of cooperation was unprecedented, predators taking breaks from hunting to contribute their efforts. Prey animals working alongside their natural enemies without fear. Days blended into nights as the work continued. Logan barely slept, sustained by some inner drive that seemed to come from the forest itself. He had developed a way of sleeping with his eyes open, still translating on autopilot while his conscious mind rested. Savannah never left his side, ready to take over when he truly couldn't continue. But those moments were rare. Logan had found his purpose, and it energized him in ways that transcended physical exhaustion. He was becoming something more than just a bear who could speak all languages. He was becoming the forest's voice incarnate, a living embodiment of its collective will. The changes in the tree were subtle at first. The soft spots in the bark stopped spreading. The yellowing of leaves slowed, then stopped. Underground, the root system began to show signs of new growth. Tiny white root hairs emerging like hope made visible. The mycorrhizal network, that wood-wide web that connected tree to tree, began to reestablish itself, helped along by the fungi the insects had brought and the improved soil conditions the collective effort had created. It was working, slowly but undeniably. The ancient tree was fighting back, drawing on the strength of the entire forest community that had rallied to save it. But Logan knew, and communicated to the others, that physical intervention alone wouldn't be enough. The tree needed something more, something that touched on the mysterious connection between all living things. And so, one evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, Logan called for the singing to begin. He started alone, his young voice producing those ancient sounds Savannah had taught him, the language that predated species differentiation. It was a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself, deep and resonant and full of life force. Savannah joined him first, her deeper voice harmonizing with his, creating a resonance that Ethan felt in his chest. Then the birds added their voices, not their usual songs, but something different, something that complemented the bears' ancient language. The wolves, who had arrived from distant territories, contributed their howls, modified to blend with the growing chorus. Every species added their voice in turn, creating layers of sound that shouldn't have worked together but somehow did. It was like listening to the earth itself singing, every form of life contributing to a harmony that transcended individual voices. The tree responded. Ethan saw it as much as felt it, a subtle brightening in the bark, a straightening of drooping branches. The leaves seemed to rustle with their own voice, adding a whisper to the chorus that made the entire song complete. The singing continued for hours, rising and falling like breath, like a heartbeat, like the rhythm of life itself. Animals that had never made music before found their voices. Even the insects contributed, their buzzing and chirping adding a high counterpoint to the deeper mammalian tones. The forest had become a single organism expressing its will through sound. As the moon rose full and bright, casting silver light through the canopy, something extraordinary happened. The tree began to glow, not with any light that science could explain, but with a vitality that was visible to every creature present. Its bark strengthened, its leaves rustled with renewed vigor, its roots, according to the underground creatures who could sense such things, spread with new purpose and strength. The singing reached a crescendo, every voice in perfect harmony, and then gradually, naturally began to fade. Not stopping abruptly, but slowly quieting like a tide going out, leaving behind a sense of completion and peace. The tree was saved. Not cured, perhaps, because the challenges it faced were ongoing, but given the strength and support to continue living, to continue serving as the forest's heart. The animals began to disperse slowly, each stopping to touch the tree in their own way, a paw, a wing, a nose, expressing gratitude and connection. Logan stood at the base of the tree, swaying with exhaustion but glowing with accomplishment. He had done more than translate. He had united the forest in a way that had never happened before, had shown them what they could accomplish together. Savannah approached her son with tears in her eyes, something Ethan hadn't known bears could do. She nuzzled Logan gently, making soft sounds that needed no translation. It was pure mother's love and pride, mixed with the bittersweet knowledge that her son had grown beyond her ability to teach. Logan had become something unprecedented, a bridge between all forms of forest life, a speaker for the speechless, a uniter of the divided. The education she had started had culminated in this moment, but it was clear that Logan's journey was far from over. In the days that followed, the forest settled into a new rhythm. The tree continued to strengthen, its recovery aided by ongoing care from various species who had taken on the responsibility of monitoring its health. But more than that, the relationships formed during the crisis persisted. Predators and prey had learned to communicate about things other than hunter and hunted. Different species had discovered common interests and shared concerns. The forest had become a community in the truest sense, and Logan sat at its center, not as a ruler, but as a facilitator, a living connection between all its diverse parts. Ethan's notebooks had grown to fill an entire shelf in his cabin. He had documented something that science said was impossible, a level of interspecies cooperation and communication that challenged everything humans thought they knew about animal intelligence and consciousness. But he still hadn't shared his discoveries with the world. Something held him back. A protective instinct, perhaps. Or maybe the understanding that some miracles were too precious to expose to scientific scrutiny. This was the forest's secret, and he was privileged to witness it, not entitled to exploit it. Logan's daily life had settled into a pattern of sorts, though no 2 days were exactly alike. Mornings often found him mediating disputes, using his gift to help different species understand each other's perspectives. A family of skunks, upset about rabbits encroaching on their territory, could have their concerns heard and addressed. Young foxes who didn't understand why the older rabbits were so fearful could learn about the history between their species and work toward better relationships. Logan had become not just a translator but a counselor, a diplomat, a teacher in his own right. The afternoon usually brought different challenges. Animals would come to Logan with problems that required cross-species cooperation to solve. A beaver dam that was flooding mouse burrows needed negotiation and compromise. Birds whose nesting trees were being damaged by woodpecker activity required mediation. Each situation demanded not just translation, but wisdom, the ability to find solutions that respected everyone's needs. Logan handled these challenges with a maturity that seemed impossible for his age, but then again, nothing about Logan was ordinary anymore. Evenings were for teaching. Young animals gathered around Logan to learn not just their own languages, but bits of others. He couldn't give them his full gift. That seemed to be unique to him, but he could teach them basic understanding, simple phrases that promoted safety and cooperation. A young rabbit might learn the hawk's hunting call to better avoid danger. A fox kit might learn enough mouse to communicate peaceful intentions. It was creating a generation that would grow up with broader understanding than any before. A future forest where communication barriers would be lower, even if they couldn't be eliminated entirely. Savannah watched all of this with quiet satisfaction. Her role had shifted from teacher to support, making sure Logan remembered to eat, to rest, to still be a bear sometimes, and not just the forest's voice. She would take him fishing in the stream, teaching him the normal bear skills he would need to survive. During these times, they would communicate in their original bear language, mother and son, without the weight of his gift between them. These moments were precious to both of them, reminders that beneath the miracle, they were still family. The change in the forest's ecosystem was becoming more pronounced. Ethan documented fewer territorial disputes, more efficient food distribution, faster responses to threats. When a forest fire threatened the eastern edge of the woods, the warning spread so quickly through Logan's network that every animal was safely evacuated before the flames arrived. When the autumn rains were late, animals that normally competed for water sources shared information about where moisture could still be found. The forest had become resilient in new ways, able to adapt to challenges through cooperation rather than mere survival of the fittest. But perhaps the most remarkable change was in how the forest dealt with human intrusion. Rather than simply fleeing or hiding when humans approached, the animals now had coordinated responses. Logan would assess the threat level and communicate appropriate reactions. Harmless hikers might find themselves surrounded by beautiful bird song and butterfly displays, encouraged to appreciate the forest without disturbing it. Hunters found the woods mysteriously empty, every animal warned well in advance. Those who came to dump trash or cause damage would be met with coordinated harassment from multiple species until they left. The forest had found its voice, and it was learning to use it to protect itself. One cool autumn morning, Ethan witnessed something that brought tears to his eyes. A young girl, probably no more than 7, had gotten separated from her family during a camping trip. She was lost, frightened, crying in the middle of the woods. Logan heard her distress and immediately went into action. But instead of approaching her directly, which might have frightened her more, He coordinated a rescue that was pure magic. Birds began singing in a pattern that created a clear path back toward the campground. Rabbits appeared at strategic points, hopping in the direction she should go. Even butterflies seemed to join in, fluttering ahead of her like guides. Logan followed at a distance, making sure the plan was working, occasionally adjusting the guidance when the girl seemed confused. Within an hour, she had been led back to the campground where her frantic parents were organizing a search party. The girl tried to tell them about the animals that had helped her, but of course they dismissed it as imagination brought on by fear. Only Ethan knew the truth, that the forest had saved her, guided by a young bear, who understood that sometimes the best help was the kind that seemed like coincidence. As autumn progressed toward winter, Savannah began teaching Logan about hibernation, about the long sleep that bears needed to survive the cold months. But it was clear that Logan's role in the forest would make normal hibernation impossible. Too many animals depended on him now, needed his voice to maintain the connections that had become essential to their survival. Together, mother and son worked out a solution. Logan would semi-hibernate, sleeping deeply for short periods while Savannah took over his duties, then waking to handle complex situations she couldn't manage alone. It wasn't ideal, but it was necessary. The first snow came early that year, blanketing the forest in white silence. But beneath the quiet, the communication network Logan had built continued to function. Winter birds carried messages about food sources. Hibernating animals were checked on by those still active. The ancient tree, now fully recovered, stood strong against the winter winds, its bare branches still serving as a meeting place for the animals that remained active. The forest had adapted to its new reality, one where every voice mattered and every creature had value beyond its role in the food chain. Ethan had started spending more time in his cabin as the weather grew colder, but he still made daily trips to observe Logan and the forest community. His notebooks had evolved from scientific observation to something more like philosophy. He wrote about consciousness and communication, about the possibility that nature had always been this connected, and humans had simply been too deaf to hear it. He wondered if Logan's gift was really unique, or if it was something that had existed before, in times when the boundary between human and nature wasn't so rigid. He even wondered if he himself was changing, becoming more attuned to the forest's languages simply through prolonged exposure to Logan's translations. One particularly cold evening, as Ethan sat by his fire reading through his notebooks, he heard a sound at his door. Opening it, he found Logan sitting in the snow, looking up at him with those intelligent eyes that seemed far too wise for such a young creature. The bear made a series of sounds that Ethan had learned meant greeting and question. Though he couldn't respond in kind, Ethan understood. Logan was checking on him, making sure the lone human in the forest was surviving the winter. It was a reversal that struck Ethan deeply, the forest caring for him rather than the other way around. Logan didn't stay long, just enough to assure himself that Ethan was well, then headed back into the snowy forest. But the visit had communicated something important. Ethan wasn't just an observer anymore. He had become part of the forest community, accepted and cared for despite his inability to fully participate in its communication network. Logan had included him in the circle of concern, had made him part of the story that was still being written in voices both ancient and new. As winter deepened, the forest's collaborative spirit was tested by scarcity and cold. Food became harder to find, shelter more precious. But instead of increasing competition, the hardship seemed to strengthen the bonds Logan had helped create. Animals shared information about food caches, warned each other about weak ice on the streams, collaborated to create communal warming spaces where different species could survive the coldest nights. Logan coordinated it all, his voice carrying through the winter air. translating needs and offers, ensuring that the most vulnerable were cared for. The ancient tree became even more important during these hard months. Its massive trunk provided shelter, its deep roots somehow still accessing nutrients that it shared through the underground network with smaller struggling trees. Logan often sat at its base, one paw on the bark, seeming to communicate with it in ways that went beyond language. Sometimes Ethan thought he could feel it too, a pulse of life that connected every living thing in the forest, with the tree as its heart and Logan as its voice. One night, during a particularly severe blizzard, Ethan heard a cacophony of animal voices through his cabin walls. Concerned, he bundled up and ventured out into the storm. Following the sounds, he found an extraordinary scene. A section of the forest had been damaged by the weight of snow and wind, trapping several animals in a collapsed den. Logan was there, coordinating a rescue effort that involved dozens of species. Deer were using their hooves to clear snow. Raccoons were digging with their clever paws. Even small birds were helping by removing twigs and debris. Logan's voice cut through the howling wind, directing efforts with precision. When the trapped animals were finally freed, including a family of foxes and an elderly badger, the celebration was brief but heartfelt. Each rescued animal touched noses with Logan, a gesture of gratitude that transcended species. Then everyone dispersed to find shelter from the ongoing storm. But not before ensuring that the rescued animals had safe places to go. It was community in action, the kind of cooperation that Logan's gift had made possible. As the rescue effort concluded and the forest settled back into storm survival mode, Ethan realized he had been accepted as part of the effort. A rabbit had brushed against his leg in passing, acknowledging his presence without fear. A cardinal had landed on his shoulder briefly, chirping something that sounded like thanks for his human hands that had helped move a particularly large branch. He wasn't just observing anymore. He had become part of the forest's story, a character in the narrative that Logan was helping to write. The winter months revealed new depths to Logan's abilities. He had learned to modify his vocalizations to account for how sound traveled differently through snow and cold air. He could throw his voice in ways that made it seem like messages were coming from multiple directions, useful for coordinating groups spread across the forest. Most remarkably, he had developed a kind of silent communication with some animals, using ultrasonic frequencies that Ethan could only detect with special equipment he'd ordered from his old university colleagues, claiming it was for a personal research project. Savannah's pride in her son had evolved into something more like awe. She had given him the foundation, but Logan had built something far beyond what she had imagined possible. He wasn't just speaking languages anymore. He was creating new forms of communication, building bridges between species that had never existed before. When she looked at him now, she saw not just her cub, but the forest's future, a living symbol of what was possible when artificial barriers were broken down. The approaching spring brought new energy to the forest. Animals began emerging from hibernation to find a world transformed by Logan's influence. The communication network had survived the winter, stronger than ever. Young animals born during the cold months were immediately integrated into the community, learning from birth that the forest was a connected whole rather than a collection of separate species. Logan, thin from his interrupted hibernation but glowing with purpose, threw himself into helping everyone prepare for the renewal that spring would bring. The ancient tree was among the first to show signs of spring, tiny buds appearing on branches that had seemed dead just weeks before. Logan spent hours sitting beneath it, apparently in deep communication. Sometimes Ethan thought he could see patterns in the way the branches moved that had nothing to do with wind, as if the tree was actively participating in conversation. It was fanciful thinking, he knew, but in a forest where a bear could speak all languages, perhaps trees could talk too if someone knew how to listen. As the snow melted and the first green shoots appeared, the forest celebrated. Logan organized what could only be described as a festival, a gathering where every species contributed something. Birds sang their most beautiful songs, not for mating or territory, but for joy. Mammals brought the first fresh foods of spring to share. Insects created aerial displays that rivaled any human fireworks. At the center of it all was Logan. No longer the small cub who had struggled with his first imitations, but a young bear coming into his power, his voice strong and sure, as he united the forest in celebration. The celebration also marked a transition. Logan was growing up, would soon be the size of an adult bear, though still young by Ursine standards. His role in the forest was evolving too. He was less teacher now and more facilitator, having given the forest the tools to communicate across species lines. Many animals had learned enough of other languages to manage basic communication without his help. The foundation he and Savannah had built was becoming self-sustaining, a permanent change in how the forest functioned. But there were still moments when only Logan could bridge certain gaps. When a pair of eagles arrived from distant mountains, speaking a dialect none of the local birds understood, Logan translated their warnings about human development approaching from the north. When an ancient turtle emerged from the deep pond with information about water quality that needed to be shared with land animals, Logan converted her slow, deep thoughts into actionable intelligence. He had become not just a translator but a keeper of knowledge, a living library of every form of communication the forest possessed. Ethan's role had evolved too. He had become the forest's human liaison of sorts, though only Logan knew about this arrangement. When developers came scouting the area, Ethan would know about it before they even arrived, warned by the forest network. He used his old connections to raise environmental concerns, to complicate permits, to make development in this area seem more trouble than it was worth. He couldn't speak for the forest the way Logan could, but he could speak to humans in ways they would understand, using law and science and bureaucracy to protect what had become sacred to him. One warm spring evening, as Ethan sat on his porch watching the sunset through newly leafed trees, he reflected on how much had changed since that first morning when he'd heard impossible sounds in the mist. The forest had revealed itself to be not just a collection of trees and animals, but a living, thinking, communicating entity. Logan had shown that the boundaries between species were artificial, that consciousness and intelligence existed in forms humans had never imagined. The notebooks that documented this transformation had become less important than the transformation itself, the daily reality of living in a forest where every voice was heard. Logan appeared at the edge of the clearing, no longer the small cub who had to look up at Ethan, but now nearly eye level when standing on all fours. He made a series of sounds that Ethan had learned meant something like, "All is well," or perhaps, "The forest is at peace." Ethan nodded, understanding flowing between them despite the language barrier. They sat together in comfortable silence, two unlikely friends watching the forest settle into evening, listening to the countless conversations that filled the air with meaning. As darkness fell, the nocturnal animals began their shift, and Logan rose to attend to his evening duties. But before leaving, he did something new. He placed his paw on Ethan's hand and made a sound Ethan had never heard before. It wasn't any animal language, but something unique, something that seemed created just for this moment. Ethan couldn't speak it back, but he understood its meaning perfectly. It was gratitude, friendship, and promise all rolled into one. It was Logan saying that Ethan was part of the forest's story now, permanently woven into its narrative. The young bear disappeared into the darkness, his voice soon heard in the distance, coordinating the night shift of the forest's activities. Ethan remained on his porch, overwhelmed by the privilege of what he had witnessed. Somewhere in the forest, Savannah was probably watching her son with that mixture of pride and bittersweetness, knowing she had succeeded in creating something unprecedented. The ancient tree stood strong at the forest's heart, its health maintained by the community that had rallied to save it. And throughout it all, the voices continued, a constant conversation that had probably always existed, but now had someone to translate it, to reveal its meaning to those willing to listen. The education that had begun with a mother bear teaching her cub to imitate bird calls had become something far greater. It had become a transformation of the forest itself, a revelation that communication was the foundation of community, that understanding could overcome any difference. Logan had become more than Savannah could have imagined, more than a bear who could speak all languages. He had become proof that the world was far more connected than anyone had realized, that consciousness and communication existed in forms beyond human comprehension. As Ethan finally went inside, he could still hear the forest's voices through his window. They no longer sounded foreign or mysterious to him. They sounded like home, like family, like a community he was blessed to be part of despite his limitations. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for the forest to demonstrate its evolved consciousness. Logan would be there to facilitate, to translate, to unite. Savannah would watch with satisfaction, knowing her impossible task had succeeded beyond her wildest dreams. And the ancient tree would stand at the center of it all, its roots connecting every living thing in ways both physical and metaphysical. The story was far from over. If anything, it was just beginning. Logan was still young, still learning, still growing into his role as the forest's voice. There would be challenges ahead, threats from the human world that would require all of the forest's newfound unity to overcome. There would be other forests that might benefit from Logan's gift, other ecosystems that could be transformed by true communication. The possibilities were endless, as vast as the network of roots beneath the forest floor, as numerous as the leaves that whispered in the wind. But for now, there was peace. The forest slept, dreaming in 1,000 different voices that had learned to speak as one. And at the heart of those dreams was a young bear named Logan, whose education had changed everything, whose gift had revealed that the world had always been speaking, if only someone knew how to listen. The magic that Savannah had passed to her son had become the forest's magic, a transformation that proved that miracles still existed, hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone with the right voice to reveal them. The spring night was warm and full of promise. Somewhere, Logan was probably helping a lost creature find its way home, translating fears into comfort, needs into solutions. Somewhere, Savannah was resting, her great task complete, her legacy secured in her remarkable son. And everywhere, the forest communicated, its voices rising and falling like breath, like music, like the sound of life itself discovering it had always been one organism, one consciousness, one voice with infinite expressions. This was Logan's gift to the forest, but also the forest's gift to the world, proof that connection was possible across any divide, that communication could heal any wound, that understanding was the foundation of all harmony. The young bear who had learned to speak every language had shown that there was really only one language after all, the language of life itself, expressing its infinite creativity through every creature that drew breath. And in learning to speak it, Logan had given the forest its voice, had shown it how to sing its ancient song in a way that even humans, if they listened carefully, might finally understand. The education was complete, but the learning would never end. Each day brought new understanding, new connections, new proof that the world was far more magical than anyone had imagined. Logan had become the bridge between worlds, the translator of the untranslatable, the voice of the voiceless. And in doing so, he had revealed that every creature had always had a voice, had always been speaking. They had just been waiting for someone to teach them how to listen to each other, how to understand that different didn't mean incomprehensible, that all languages were ultimately saying the same thing, expressing the same fundamental truth that connected every living thing. The forest had found its voice through a young bear named Logan, and that voice would echo through generations, changing everything it touched, proving that miracles weren't just possible but necessary, that magic wasn't just real but essential, that the world had always been speaking to those who knew how to listen. And now, thanks to a mother's impossible gift to her son, everyone could learn to hear the conversation that had been happening all along, the endless, beautiful dialogue of life itself.